China has just pulled the plug on $2.4 billion worth of American LNG without warning. In a single move, the US lost its second largest energy customer, and before Washington could react, China had already signed a 15-year supply deal with Australia, locking in a new partner. As news broke, Trump erupted on stage, firing off warnings and blame. At the same time, Europe began reshaping its import strategies, seizing the moment to reduce reliance on American gas. Meanwhile, Australia quietly stepped up, positioning itself as China's go-to energy supplier and emerging as a new global power player. But this isn't just about a single contract, it's a strategic power shift. China is redrawing global energy routes and realigning long-term alliances. While Beijing moves with precision, Washington scrambles to keep up. Billions are bleeding from the US energy sector, and the balance of global influence is tipping fast. If you think this is just about business deals, think again. This is economic warfare, a high-stakes game where strategy, leverage, and timing determine who rises and who falls. And right now, America is on the back foot. In today's video, we're breaking down exactly what's happening, what's at stake, and how this shift could impact all of us. The shock. In a move that stunned global markets and sent immediate ripples through the energy world, China abruptly halted all liquefied natural gas imports from the United States. This wasn't a phased policy shift or the result of months of quiet negotiations. It was sudden, sharp, and surgical. One day, shipments were flowing. The next, a cold, calculated stop. No early signals, no leaks to the media. Just a brief statement issued by Beijing, confirming that a trade worth over $2.4 billion annually had come to an immediate end. The impact was immediate and brutal. LNG exporters in the US, who had come to rely on China as a key customer, found themselves blindsided. The United States, which had just claimed the title of the world's largest LNG exporter, had been shut out of its second largest overseas market. Plants in Texas, Louisiana, and beyond, geared for high-capacity output, were left in limbo. Shipping schedules were torn up, contracts unraveled, energy analysts scrambled to assess the fallout, but one thing was clear: this was no ordinary trade dispute. The question everyone asked was simple: why now? Why this? And the answer came down to just one word: tariffs. Only a month earlier, the US government had reintroduced a sweeping 10% tariff on Chinese goods, reigniting a long-dormant trade war. Frustrated by what it viewed as unfair trade practices, Washington aimed to pressure Beijing into making economic concessions, but China didn't retaliate with a press conference or harsh words. Instead, it made a move that hit the US economy where it hurt: its booming energy sector. Cutting off LNG wasn't just about dollars, it was about leverage. It was about showing the world that China could pivot quickly, decisively, and without hesitation, and it did. While US officials were still drafting statements, China had already begun reassigning its LNG orders elsewhere. The retaliation was silent but deafening. This wasn't just a diplomatic jab, it was a geopolitical chess move, and it marked the beginning of something far bigger than a single canceled contract. The pivot. The shock of China's LNG cutoff had barely registered before the real strategy unfolded. Unlike past trade disputes filled with heated rhetoric and televised threats, China didn't respond with words. It responded with precision and planning. The decision to halt US LNG imports wasn't just a reaction, it was a calculated pivot designed to rewire its energy supply chain overnight. And that's exactly what happened. Within days, Chinese LNG shipments that were once headed for American ports were being rerouted to Europe, a region still scrambling for energy security after severing ties with Russian gas. The timing was perfect. Europe was hungry for alternatives, and China was ready to deliver. Countries like Germany, the Netherlands, and Italy jumped at the opportunity. They adjusted import policies almost immediately, cleared bureaucratic red tape, and began expanding port infrastructure to accommodate the redirected flow. Behind the scenes, energy transfer systems were reconfigured, pipelines rerouted, and storage capacities scaled up. The US, meanwhile, was left watching as billions of dollars in potential revenue slipped through its fingers. Not to mention the global influence that came with being a major energy supplier to allies across the Atlantic. The blow wasn't just economic, it was strategic. Europe had been central to America's post-Russia energy vision. Now that vision was unraveling. And still, China wasn't finished. As Europe opened its doors, China quietly secured a 15-year, $1.5 billion LNG deal with Australia through China Resources Gas, one of the largest energy conglomerates in the country. It wasn't just about diversifying imports. This was a long-term commitment, a declaration of intent. Beginning in 2027, Australia will supply 600,000 tons of LNG per year to China. That volume, while seemingly modest compared to past US exports, carries enormous strategic value. It's stable, it's closer, and most critically, it's not American. In one sweeping series of moves, China not only replaced the US as a supplier, it improved its position. It deepened ties with Europe, fortified its relationship with Australia, and rewired the very flow of global energy. While the US stood still, China moved entire continents. So where does that leave Australia in all of this? Why would a traditional ally of the United States step into the very space America was just pushed out of? Australia's rise. The answers lie in the details and in the brilliance of China's strategy. The deal China signed with Australia isn't just practical, it's strategic genius. For one, Australian LNG is 20% cheaper than American gas. In an energy market where every percentage point counts, that cost advantage isn't just beneficial, it's irresistible. Then there's geography. Australia is far closer to China than the US, and that translates to faster shipping times, up to 10 days quicker. In a world increasingly shaped by logistics, timing is everything. But the real shockwave isn't in the price or the speed, it's in the symbolism. Australia, long seen as one of the US's most reliable partners in the Asia-Pacific, is now China's #1 energy partner. That shift sends a very loud and very clear message. Energy deals are no longer just about economics, they're about power, positioning, and priorities. The centerpiece of this pivot is the Woodside contract, a 15-year deal that kicks off in 2027. But this agreement is more than just an exchange of resources. It's a geopolitical statement. It signals that Australia is no longer content to play a supporting role in global affairs. No longer the understudy to American influence, Australia is stepping onto the main stage, not as a follower, but as a leader. The world's energy orchestra is changing, and while the US scrambles to recover from a massive disruption, Australia is already tuning up, ready to play lead in a performance that could redefine the global balance of power. America's energy fallout. Back in the United States, the picture looked very different and far more chaotic. As China secured new supply lines and allies, America's energy sector was thrown into disarray. LNG terminals, once bustling with outbound shipments destined for Asia, were now sitting on mountains of unsold stock. Facilities designed to operate at full capacity were forced to scale back, as canceled contracts piled up and vessels sat idle, waiting for orders that would never come. The financial consequences were immediate. Shipping costs soared, with companies now scrambling to find alternative buyers and reroute their cargo under pressure. Markets reacted sharply. Investors who had once banked on American LNG as a reliable global export began to panic. Stock prices dropped, confidence eroded, and in the background, analysts began whispering what few wanted to say out loud. The US wasn't just losing revenue, it was losing its grip on global energy leadership. Trump had declared with characteristic flair during a rally speech, referring to the potential of American energy exports to dominate the global stage. He promised that tariffs would protect American industry, restore fairness, and keep the country strong. But in reality, the opposite happened. Instead of strengthening America's hand, Trump's tariff-driven trade strategy weakened it fast. What was meant to defend US manufacturing ended up alienating key partners, provoking retaliatory measures, and forcing once reliable allies to look elsewhere. The energy fallout wasn't just economic, it was symbolic. It marked the beginning of a larger unraveling, one where the US found itself increasingly isolated in a game it once controlled. And as new alliances formed across the Pacific and the Atlantic, America watched, not from the driver's seat, but from the sidelines. While America struggled to contain the fallout from its own policies, another quiet shift was taking place just north of the border, one that would reshape energy dynamics across North America. US LNG exporters scrambled and allies distanced themselves. Canada saw the writing on the wall and moved quickly. Canada's quiet escape. Just as the United States doubled down on its tariff campaign, this time targeting Canadian oil and gas imports, China made its next move. In stepped Rongsheng Petrochemical, a major Chinese oil refining company. It quietly established a presence in Calgary, deep in Canada's energy heartland, and began signing deals with some of the country's biggest energy players, Suncor, Shell, and BP. These weren't just symbolic gestures, they were multi-stream partnerships covering not only liquefied natural gas, but also crude oil, a critical pillar of Canada's export economy. At the center of this shift was a powerful new infrastructure project, the Trans Mountain Expansion. Recently completed, the TMX pipeline tripled Canada's capacity to move crude oil from Alberta to the Pacific coast. For the first time, Canadian energy could be shipped directly to Asia without touching US ports or pipelines. This bypass wasn't just logistical, it was strategic freedom, because this wasn't just trade, it was liberation. Canada had been almost entirely dependent on the US as a customer for its energy exports. More than 95% of Canadian oil went south, but now, with tariffs threatening that relationship, Canada stopped waiting. It stopped knocking on America's door. Instead, it opened its own entrance to the global stage. Through investment, infrastructure, and strategic diplomacy, Canada quietly built a new path, one that connected it directly to the fastest growing markets in the world. While the US clung to old dynamics, Canada redefined its future and did it without fanfare. The BRICS Gambit. While the United States remained tangled in the fallout of its tariff policies, another shift was quietly gaining momentum, one with the potential to alter the very foundation of the global financial system. As Washington struggled to maintain leverage through trade restrictions and retaliatory measures, the BRICS alliance, led by China, Russia, India, Brazil, and South Africa, was building something far more ambitious. At the center of their plan, a new financial weapon, a gold-backed blockchain-powered currency, a direct challenge to the dominance of the US dollar. Unlike traditional trade adjustments, this wasn't just about regional influence. It was a structural overhaul aimed at bypassing the global currency that has underpinned international trade for nearly a century. With this new system, BRICS countries could settle cross-border transactions in their own currencies, backed by a reserve of gold and advanced blockchain architecture for security and transparency. The implications were massive. If successful, this move would allow entire nations to conduct energy deals, development loans, and trade agreements without ever touching the US dollar. In a single strategic play, BRICS was positioning itself not just as a coalition of emerging markets, but as a legitimate alternative to the Western financial order. President Trump, unsurprisingly, responded with fury. In a fiery speech, he threatened import taxes as high as 150% on any country that dared to play games with the dollar. It was a bold statement, meant to intimidate and contain the growing shift, but it lacked the teeth it once had. Because threats in this new era no longer worked. In perhaps the most symbolic move of all, Cuba joined the BRICS alliance, bypassing over 60 years of US sanctions with a single diplomatic handshake. For a nation long isolated by American policy, joining BRICS wasn't just economic, it was political rebirth. But Cuba was just one of many. The real story was the global pivot happening in plain sight. Nations were no longer waiting for Western approval. They were building new systems, new partnerships, and new paths forward, ones that didn't include the dollar, and increasingly didn't include America. The financial battlefield had expanded, and as BRICS pressed forward with its vision, the US found itself responding to a future it no longer controlled. The scoreboard. By the end of 2024, the results were impossible to ignore. The numbers painted a picture of a world shifting, and fast. While American markets stumbled, China surged ahead. The MSCI China Index climbed by 28%, signaling global investor confidence in China's economic direction. In stark contrast, the Nasdaq plummeted by 10.8%, the S&P 500 fell by 6.3%, and the Dow Jones dropped 4.4%. The message was clear. China wasn't just recovering, it was accelerating, while the US continued to struggle through volatility and uncertainty. Behind these numbers were deeper forces at work. As US consumer confidence dipped, shaken by inflation, political instability, and trade turbulence, foreign direct investment into China soared by 88.4%. Corporations and investors were no longer hesitant. They saw opportunity in infrastructure, in growth, and in China's long-term strategic clarity. That clarity came through in China's focus on the industries of the future: electric vehicles, artificial intelligence, biotechnology, and pharmaceuticals. These weren't just tech buzzwords, they were the sectors pulling in global capital. While American firms scrambled to adapt, China was already scaling, attracting innovation, manufacturing, and influence. The US wasn't just losing revenue, it was losing relevance, one market share at a time. And the shift wasn't limited to finance. From pipelines to politics, from tariffs to tankers, the world was watching as a new energy empire quietly emerged. Every new deal, every redirect, every alliance told the same story. America was bleeding power, not with a bang, but with a series of small, avoidable losses, and each one pushed it further from the leadership position it once held unchallenged.